So, Carl, thank you for joining me today.
It's my pleasure.
Carl, you've been to, sorry for saying it, to pretty much every fancy university in the world. You went to Harvard Medical School, to Oxford, to Columbia. You are a scientist, you're an entrepreneur, you're a physician. How do you define yourself with so many achievements and titles?
Yeah, it's a good question. I describe myself lately as a physician, scientist, entrepreneur, and author. And then I say, and I obviously have ADHD because I can't pay attention to anything for a long time. And I get bored easily. So for me, it's been really wonderful to be able to move in between different worlds and learn different things and acquire new skills because I'm a restless soul. But I feel very blessed, obviously, because I've been to some, obviously the best universities in the world and learned from not only the best professors and teachers, but what's amazing about these institutions is they attract other brilliant students. So you learn as much from your peers as you do the professors, and I think that's always important for people thinking about where to go to school. I always say go to the best school you get into because you're going to learn as much from your peers as you are your professors.
I understand. And then another thing that you're an author. I remember you wrote the book Rewired, Protecting Your Brain in the Digital Age. Why did you decide to become an author?
Yeah, it's interesting because as an academic, I published papers and I learned to write originally academic writing, which is a very technical kind of writing. And I remember the first manuscript I drafted and I sent it to my mentor at the time. And we were using Microsoft Word, so he was tracking the changes. And it looked like he had rewritten the whole thing. And I was just mortified. I was like, oh my God, I did a terrible job. And he sent me this really polite note and he said, don't worry about all the changes. I'm just rearranging things to meet the expectations of the reviewers. The content is actually good. And I was like, oh, okay. It never occurred to me that you could rearrange words on a page or in a sentence to meet the expectations of a particular audience. So that was lesson one. The nice thing about technical writing, like publishing papers in medical journals, is they have a very strict format, right? Abstract has to be this many pages. There's an introduction, there's methodologies, results, and then discussion, right? They're all the same. So structure-wise, you don't actually have to think. You just have to fill in your research into those buckets. So from a creative perspective, it's very constraining, actually. The goal there is not to be constraining. So that was my world of writing for a long time. And then when I started to build companies, obviously you want to do public relations, and we started to blog, before it was trendy. And that's a different kind of writing, right? So now you're free form, but you have to be short and pithy and catch people's attention. So that was new. And then, where you and I met through the Aspen Institute, we had to come up with a plan, an idea, something to help have a positive impact on the planet, and that's what gave birth to the book, and that was quite a project.
And so because of the book, actually, I want to ask you two types of questions. Most of the time when I speak with authors, I speak with them only about the concept of writing. But in your case, your book is about the impact of the digital era on children's brain. And I know that also writing books and reading also have a very significant impact on children's brain and well-being, let's call it this way. And I really wonder, what should our young authors know about the connection between writing and reading and the well-being?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. What I can say and what I talk about in the book is how reading, in particular, learning to read, which typically occurs between ages 3 and 5, although more and more the American Academy of Pediatrics and other medical bodies are saying, start reading from the first day they come out at birth, right? Which is kind of interesting. And the reason is, I think, even more interesting. So reading as a concept, as a skill, is not neurobiologically wired. So what do I mean by that? That means we do not have a network of neurons in our brain that are dedicated and pre-wired to read or write. In fact, history shows us that it wasn't until about 5,000 years ago that there was any evidence of either one, reading or writing. So that means in our brains haven't really fundamentally changed, by the way, in 50, 100,000 years. So 5,000 years is nothing from a brain evolution perspective. So that means that in order for us to read and write, we have to acquire this skill. And acquiring any skill, particularly a complex skill, requires intentional practice, right? Intentional practice means head down, focus, typically with a teacher, as much as possible one-on-one, but even one-to-many, and just doing it over and over again. And what the neuroscience shows is fascinating in that we recruit, meaning we gather and pull together different parts of the brain as we learn to read and write that previously weren't talking to each other. So if you look at the brains of young people who have practiced and are on the right path to writing and reading, versus the brains of kids who maybe spend too much time watching videos or distracting themselves with other technologies, their brains look very different. And the big difference is that network that we now know is critical for reading and writing in those who have practiced it over and over again in a focused manner is very robust and quite easy to see. And those who haven't, it isn't. And unfortunately, those who don't develop that skill have a lot of consequences down the road. And I'm happy to tell you about those if you're interested.
I actually want to learn more about it, and also about the mental well-being.
Right.
I know that, again, from a lot of our authors, that they wrote about things that were challenging for them, like COVID and, their families and stuff like this. And they almost like they found some comfort in writing. So to your first question, and also about that.
Okay, so I think there's two parts to that. I think part one is building those networks of neurons that allow us to read and write sets us up for future success academically, but also we learn what's called self-control. So it turns out that reading and writing requires an awful lot of a part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, which, as you know, I wrote a lot about in the book, because I want people to be aware that this precious part of the brain, which is unique to humans and takes about 20 to 30 years to fully develop in humans, is very precious, and we have to take care of it. And learning to read and write is actually a wonderful way of developing our prefrontal cortex. So not only do we learn to read and write, but we also learn self-control and emotion regulation, and that creates resilience. So you're less likely as you get older, once you have the skills of reading and writing, and of course other things, to be able to manage your emotions, and that will contribute to well-being and make you less likely to succumb to mental illness, whether it's depression, anxiety, or ADHD. Now, you actually went to a different place with your question, which is the content of what people are writing is cathartic, meaning it's therapeutic. So there's a whole, first you got to have the skill to read and write to be involved with you, but then you need content. And I think that it would not be surprising to me that anyone writing their first book is speaking from the heart, right? Because writing's hard, so you need that motivation. And so speaking about things that have been challenging, putting it on paper, we know, putting my psychiatrist hat on, we know that psychotherapy, journaling is actually one of the most effective therapeutic tools you can have. And I suspect writing a book is really just a form of journaling.
Yeah, we definitely saw a lot of examples like this, and it's interesting. Like I want to keep talking with you now for 2 hours just about this subject.
Well, we can do it.
Yeah, maybe we'll do it later. But I do want to take you now from the physician hat to the author's hat. So, as you said, we met in Aspen, and you decided that you will write a book, which is a very important book. This is there is a big issue that you wanted to share with the world, and the book is, by the way, highly recommended if you didn't read it, for you and your parents. But tell me about this moment when you decide to write a book and what you do next.
Yeah, it's a great point. So I think that, the moment of inspiration I describe in the introduction, which is watching this research experiment, which, at the time we had no idea what we were actually doing, and to watch young people and take away their smartphone for 1 hour, and they're getting paid $150 to do the easiest task you can imagine, watch TV. And then there was another group that they were able to watch TV with their smartphone. And all we were doing is comparing their behaviors and looking at the impact on advertising and content and whatnot. And we were in this beautiful lab in downtown New York, and we had closed circuit TV, and I'm watching this 19-year-old who is squirming in her seat. Like she's not sitting still. And I'm watching, I was like, she does not look good. I mean, she's got this scowl on her face. She can't. So she's agitated. I'm like, something's wrong with her. Gets up, walks out of the room, grabs her phone. Boom. Okay. Next one, same thing. Next one, same thing. I was like, what's going on? So I go out and I ask, did you see any strange behaviors beforehand? No, they were perfectly fine. Did they ask for their money? Nope. They just asked for their phone and left. And all I could think is, this is the oddest behavior I've ever seen. I mean, I'd been doing research at that point for well over a decade, maybe 15 years. And I'd never seen human participants doing a study so simple, get up and walk out of the room. Right? What's going on? And what I thought then, and I think the book reinforces, is that these young women were going through a form of withdrawal, just like a drug. You get a drug, you get addicted to it, you take it away, your body starts to shake, and you have all these symptoms. And that was the moment when I said, wow, is it possible that we're forming an addiction to this device? Which is a big word as a psychiatrist. And I thought, you know what? And I started doing a little research and taking some notes. I had no thought I was going to write a book at that point. I just thought, this is important. And the more I researched, the more I was like, oh boy, this is actually bigger than I thought. And then I thought, okay, how do I get this idea out in the world? And that's when the idea to write a book came, right? It was such a big topic. It was going to require references. It was beyond just an academic paper. Maybe a book was the right forum to do that. Having never wrote a book, being quite anxious about writing a book, knowing it was going to be a lot of work, but that's how it started.
So you find everything that you just found. You never wrote a book, and we remember the people that are listening to us are mainly children or kids or teenagers that never wrote a book, and they're writing their first book. Yeah. You sit next to your laptop or your paper or whatever. How do you start? What's that?
So for me, honestly, having never done it before, I said, okay, what's the closest thing I could think of to doing this? And I literally went back to, my school days. I said, okay, well, you had an assignment. What do you want to be when you grow up? Okay, what are you going to do for summer? Right? You had to sit down and start somewhere. And, I don't know about you or your audience, but I was taught to write an outline. Right? Just kind of frame it out. So, okay. So that's what I did. I sat down. So I'm going to write an outline. So what does the beginning, middle, and end look like? And once I had that framework, and you see it in the book, the first section is Rewired. The first section is Pre-wired. The second section is Rewired. And the third section is Beyond wired. And those were 3 buckets that helped me organize my thinking, right? So section 1, wired, we're wired to connect. So I write about how we're wired to connect. Section 2, rewire. Introduce, this thing comes along and everything blows up and the wires go crazy. Third section, beyond wired, what can we do to help ourselves in the future? That's it. 1, 2, 3. And 300 plus pages fall out of that simple outline. I think once you have a framework in the form of an outline and a beginning, middle, and end. Look, the thing that's key, and I would say to all your students, stories are what we are wired to engage with. Like before we were writing, we were sitting around a campfire and we were telling stories, right? And what is a story? A story, has a beginning, middle, and end. What do I mean by that? Well, someone gets up in the morning and it's a normal day, and then something happens, and that terrible thing happens, and you're shocked, and I don't know what to do, and then you decide, I don't want to do this, but I'm going to overcome adversity, and you overcome adversity, and then there's trials and tribulations along the way, and you hope you learn something, and then you're like, ta-da, I learned something, and you go back and you share it with the world. That's a story, right? So I think, once you have an idea, whether it's something that happened to you at home, or a relationship that went badly, or trying to learn a new skill that was harder than you thought, really anything that has, some tension in it, I think your students can write about. And it's kind of simple, like set the stage. What was the adversity you had to overcome? And then what was the lesson learned that you can share with other people? And there's your story.
So just you draw like an outline, let's call it a map. You create the different steps, and then you just start filling it up. And like you said, suddenly you find yourself with 300 pages over there. Yeah. And then you wrap it and you read your book. It's not the book, let's call it, you read the draft for the first time. And what you do next, like you start reorganizing, you ask other people to do I know, by the way, you published at Harvard Press. I'm sure you had like editors, etc. So I'm sure you had to do like your own process and then external process. Now in the case of our children, most of them they will do their own process, and then usually it's a parent or close family that will help them.
Well, I think to that point, you won't be surprised. I asked a few friends to read the manuscript before I sent it to the editor, because I knew the editor was very busy, and I wanted to just get a feel, like, am I on the right track? Does this make sense? Is there some big areas that you can identify that needs help? And that was hugely helpful, and that helped me refine the voice a little bit, take a few things out, add a few things. And I sent that first manuscript to the editor after, a couple close friends had read it who were interested in the topic. They had children. And then the editor, really came back, and it was interesting, only edited at an extremely high level. Like, this section's got to go, tighten this up. And I said to him, I was like, well, there's not a lot of notes here. He's like, yeah, well, the goal is really to kind of get that landscape down. And then the work begins, which, whether it's a parent or older sibling who can sit down and just help you kind of rearrange some of the words on the page. And that's where, the copy editing comes in, line by line, and thinking like, does this actually make sense? Because what happens is, and I know for me, it probably happens for everybody, is you make connections in your own brain as a writer that other people reading it don't see, right? And so you take these logical leaps, and the reader gets lost. And in your head, you're like, well, of course they know that. I was like, well, no, you didn't actually connect those dots. And so having other people read it, I think, is critical.
Yeah, and Carl, even more than that, you are writing, and I think I was one of the first buyer of your books. I think I bought it like months before it actually was sent to me. And what's special about your book is that you take something which is a extremely complicated subject, and you made it very accessible to something like me that I don't really know this word. So. And this happens to every author. You have, like, let's say you created a very complicated world in your head, but then you need to make sure that somebody that just entered this world in 1 second understand it. How do you take a subject that is so complicated and make it understandable and readable by a total dumb person like me?
Well, there's nothing dumb about you, but the way I was taught is act like you're writing for your best friend's mother, because you'll have a certain respect for her because she's your best friend's mom. But of course, there's no expectation she would have any idea what you're talking about because you don't spend a lot of time with her. So you have to explain it in a way that's respectful and thoughtful, but simple enough that the complex concepts get broken down into their most digestible pieces. So as you know, I use a metaphor in the book for the brain, right? This idea of a conductor is the prefrontal cortex, who is pulling in different other areas of the brain, really trying to build up to a symphony that ultimately has harmony. And my concern about too much time on these devices and too much distraction and too many other things in our lives we can talk about is that creates the opposite of harmony, cacophony, noise, right? And so sometimes simple metaphors are important. I mean, one of the things I worked hard on was not to get too lost in the neuroscience and the neurobiology, even though I love it, because just because I love it doesn't mean other people care, right? You have to give what's relevant.
So it's almost like, and again, I'm going into kind of my world, and imagine that I created a very complicated world. If I'll go too much in every tiny detail, the reader then might get lost. So maybe
that's right.
Yeah. And did you create an element of a build-up? So for example, you told me about the cortex, which was the first time I heard about the cortex many years before. So now I know what's a cortex. So do you use the fact that you introduce something and then you can build up on it as you go with the book, or you still try to keep it like in a very basic level?
Well, that's a great point. So I think, from a brain perspective, brain is very complex. I try to introduce a lot of different elements, but the core theme throughout the book is that the prefrontal cortex is what matters. And then over time, the reader who sticks with the book learns all the different roles it can play. And then I hope takes away why we should all be dedicating our time to protecting our prefrontal cortex, right? Because it's the difference between impulse and insight, reaction and reflection, and inattention and focus. So it's really what makes us human, for better for worse. And I would argue that most of the challenges in our world is because people's prefrontal cortex haven't they've kind of gotten lost or distracted, and their emotions or their reward systems take over, whether it's through addiction or dysregulation or mental illness, and that leads to all kinds of problems. But yeah, it's very hard to keep it simple. The KISS acronym, keep it simple, stupid. I kept saying that over and over again as I was writing the book.
And the beginning of your book is kind of speaks to everybody. Like, we are all worried about the subject, right? We all, into a certain level, we are aware of it. The content itself, you're the expert. It was, I would say, easy for you to deliver it. Actually, maybe the point was to simplify it for me. How do you end? How do you end the book in a way that it will be whatever you wanted it to be?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I was taught that the ending of a great story is some kind of resolution to the conflict and then a lesson learned. And so for me, as I was going through this, to be honest, I started to get a little depressed. I was like, oh, this is kind of a downer, right? This is all bad news. And the more I read, the more I researched, the more I integrated stuff, the more concerned I became. And I realized, and remember, I'm writing this book now 5-6 years ago, well before the pandemic, well before, as you say, we're all aware of it now. The pandemic actually made us all aware that these screens aren't healthy. This was at a time when people were like, oh, more is the better, right? More screens is better. Really? And, I started to think like, all right, I can't end this book with, the world's on fire, right? Who wants to read that book? So I started to think, how can we, what's the lesson here? Number one. And then number two, for something that was such a downer, how do we end with hope, right? How do we end with something we can aspire to? So the idea of the final section beyond Wired is to give recommendations. There's 10 recommendations that are based on the science of protecting our prefrontal cortex that are, I think, simple and accessible and easy to do. There's recommendations about looking for warning signs in friends and loved ones who maybe have problematic behaviors related to mobile media, communications and information technology. And there's the last sections about hope, right? That, look, we've been on this planet a long time. We've accomplished great things as a society, and we can do this. We just have to be a little more intentional. We have to be more proactive than reactive, and we have to be thoughtful, and get back to our roots, our core, which is connecting with people as much as possible face to face without distractions, right? Because that's what we are wired to do.
So I cannot end our discussion with something better than, talking about hope and building a hope into the end of the story, which is, I would guess that 80% of the books end with some element of hope, mystery hope or clear hope or etc. So Carl, really, I'm very grateful for your time. I'm sure our young authors, if they'll get the chance, they will probably have so many questions for you, both as a psychiatrist and as an author. One tiny little question: do you plan to write another book?
So the short answer is, I think so. And what I realized, Ami, and you'll appreciate this, might be a fun way to end. I wrote a book that's 300 pages of small font, with no pictures. That's about people's short attention. So that probably was a bad idea. So I want to write another book that's shorter, with big font, lots of pictures, keep it even more simple, and retell the story that is even more accessible to a bigger audience, because it requires a fair amount of attention span to read my book as it stands. So I want to try to make it even more simple for more people to enjoy and learn from.
Well, I actually have a challenge for you. Why won't you write a book on BriBooks that is built specifically for children, about what they should be aware of as in the digital era?
That idea. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about
20, 25 pages, big fonts. I'm pretty sure there's like hundreds of thousands of kids that would want to read your book. So just saying.
Let's talk about that. I love it. I love it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the time together.